Hi, we're ready to read chapter 19 of A Day of Rest by Edna Creekmore Carmen. And I'm going to show you the picture that goes with this chapter. A foggy evening. As the steady clop-clop of Ralph McRaylor's mule died in the distance, Doug stopped wondering about what was happening at home and began wondering what was keeping Jas. It was just over a mile to the Bartons' place, and a boy of 14 should be able to walk that distance in no time. Doug leaned back against the car, forcing himself to relax. There was nothing he could do until Jas appeared. The sounds of early evening slowly died as Doug stared through the dusk and mist at the graveled road where Jas should appear. The mournful lament of the dove became silent as the bird rose from the fog-bound willow tree on the banks of the creek and flew upwards, seeking a brighter perch higher up on the mountain. The cheerful chirp of the cricket and the steady piping of the tree frogs stopped as the cooler night air chilled the singers to silence. The mist floated on the cool breeze, spreading out and folding in the trees and shrubs, thickening until only the dark shapes of the nearby trees stood stark against the background of white. The fog surrounded the car and the man and formed an island of loneliness and silence, muting the ripple of the creek and the rustle of the leaves on the nearby trees. Doug's eyes adjusted to the darkness, but there was nothing to see. The fog closed in and swallowed the road and even the nearby trees. The shuffling of the brown and white beagle trotting along the edge of the road with its nose to the ground was the first indication that someone was coming. The beagle came to a stop and raised its head to stare at the man leaning against the car as a tall, lanky boy carrying a willow sapling fishing rod appeared in the fog. "Good evening, Jas. In a hurry?" "Hello, Uncle Doug." "No, I'm not in a hurry. I know what I'll get when I get home for staying out so late and not being at home to help with the milking. No point in hurrying home for that." "Weren't you going to church?" "Church? It's the third Sunday. The church doors were open when I passed." Jas stood stock still and gazed at Doug. "You don't mean it," he breathed in horror. "It's too late for you to worry about that now," Doug said flatly. "As it is, I'm thankful because I can use your help." "Be glad to help. What's up?" "Bert and Jim Weaver have been kidnapped." "Kidnapped?" "By the Bartons." "By the Bartons down here? Are you sure? They just got home not long ago. They passed in a wagon while I was still fishing. I saw that wagon pull into their barn shed when I came along just now." "They're the ones. And yes, I'm almost sure." But Doug paused, considering the situation. Then, shaking his head as if to clear it of any doubts, he continued, "If I'm not mistaken, Bert and Jim were in that wagon." Straightening up, Doug continued, "Let's walk along, Jas, as I tell you about it." Jas placed his fishing pole beside the car. With the one word, "Stay," to the beagle, he followed as Doug led the way back up the road. Doug told Jas how Bert had taken Susan to the Oak Trail School to the singing convention, how Jim Weaver had started home from the schoolhouse with Bert and Susan, how Bert had taken Jim and Susan to the mines, and how Susan had come along home, dirty but unhurt. Susan was hysterical, but I did get out of her the fact that 3 men surprised Bert and Jim while they were at the mines. 2 of them tied Bert and Jim up and put them in the wagon with some jugs they took out of the mine. Why didn't the men take Susan? Bert told Susan to hide. That was the one good thing out of this whole mess. Susan did hide and stayed hidden until the men took Bert and Jim away in the wagon. I wouldn't have thought she could have done it, but Susan came home all the way by herself. I've considered everyone that there has been even a whisper about making whiskey, and the only ones I could come up with which fit the description of the men that Susan gave were Slim and Ed Barton. I wish I'd known Bert was in that wagon, Jas said gruffly. I'd have got him out. That would have solved everything if you had, Jas. Doug paused for breath before continuing. As it is, I don't know where Bert and Jim are now. I don't think Mrs. Barton would let them bring the boys into the house as prisoners. Oh no, Jas said hurriedly. Liza Barton is as good as they come. She would never allow the men to bother Jim or Bert. So we will look for them in the outbuildings, Doug continued after the interruption. To sneak around in the dark in a strange place without getting caught in the act, I need you for a lookout. I had thought to ask Charles, but he's gone to church, which may be for the best. I think you will be more what I want. As he finished speaking, Doug broke into a run, followed closely behind by Jas. Silently, the two jogged up the road, the whispering swish of Doug's pants and the soft pad of his shoes on the gravel road was the only sounds that could be heard. With his cut-off overalls and bare feet, Jas made no noise. All around them was silence. Suddenly, that silence was broken by a long, drawn-out scream. It sounded as if someone was in deep agony and appealing for help. Almost immediately, the piercing scream was repeated. What's that? Doug stopped. If those Bartons were torturing either of the boys, he wouldn't need Al with his gun. He would beat them up with his bare hands. It's a cat, Jas said hurriedly. Hear them all the time. Doug had already come to the same sensible conclusion, but listened intently as the cry was repeated. It's on the top of the hill, moving south. They both agreed, coming from the mountains, moving slowly south. It was a panther on the prowl. Still, Doug felt uneasy. He broke into a run again. Almost immediately, he had to drop back to a walk. The fog before them was so thick it formed a solid wall. As the two entered the white mass, they could scarcely see each other. Only the gravel beneath their feet told them that they were still on the road. Do you know where we are, Jas? Almost halfway, I think. We could pass the house in this fog without knowing it. I don't think so, Jas objected. The house is higher up on the side of the hill and farther up from the creek. The fog is thick here because the creek runs right under the road. That hollow sound means we're on the bridge now. Al's place is off to the left. We'll be going uphill from here, and the fog will thin out soon. Sure enough, the two walked into a clear space shortly afterwards, and although the fog closed in again, it wasn't as solid as before. The two were able to walk at a fast pace. Soon, Jas stopped and pointed to the right. Uncle Doug, if we cut across this field and up through the woods, we can cut off that long curve ahead. Jas pointed off to the right. That way we'd come in back of the barn. That's a good idea, Jas, Doug agreed. If we come in back of the barn, the Bartons will be less likely to see us. Abandoning the road immediately, Doug vaulted the rail fence and began running up through the field with Jas just behind. As the two climbed the steep hillside meadow, the fog thinned and became luminescent. Doug glanced upward, looking for the cause of the light, but couldn't see through the fog above. It must be the moon that turned the fog into a bath of light, he decided, as he ran toward the trees standing as dark sentinels at the edge of the meadow. Into the woods they ran. Into darkness. After only a few steps, Doug stopped. He could see a tree only when he was right on it. He raised his arms to protect his face as he crept forward. Jas touched his arm. "Better let me go first," Jas suggested to his uncle. "We'll go faster since I know the path. They have piled junk on both sides. You could get hurt if you stumble on the junk in the dark." "Okay, Jas." Stepping to one side, Doug allowed Jas to move in front and followed him more by hearing than by sight between the dark shadows of the trees. At the edge of a clearing, Jas waited for Doug to catch up. "That is the Bartons' pasture at the back of their barn," Jas said, as he pointed ahead to the open field across the road. "Moonlight?" Doug gasped as he looked at the yellow circle hanging above the mountain across the valley filled with white fog. "Yeah, just as I said, we're up above the fog now," Jas boasted. "We'll be able to see better, but they will be able to see us better also," Doug cautioned. "We'll have to be careful." "We can see the house from here," Jas replied, "and there's Slim and Ed at the kitchen table. But I don't see Rob." "Rob may not have gotten home yet. Susan said he objected to the men taking the boys and started off walking." "That sounds like Rob. He wouldn't hurt the boys. I'm surprised he let the others take him. Probably knew that he wasn't strong enough to stop them. If Rob is home, he'll be on our side. If he isn't home, all we have to do is watch out for Slim and Ed." And that's the end of chapter 19.